Okay, so we're going to look at Matthew 7, verses 1 through 6, starting chapter 7, the final chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. And if you glance through what we're looking at over just kind of the different headers, judging others, asking when we give in the golden rule, all that, it seems like all these teachings are disconnected. Whereas everything before this has been kind of a continual kind of building off of each other. But there's actually a loose connection between all of these different passages, and it's kind of under the umbrella of relationships. He's kind of at the very end showing us how we relate to one another, how do we relate to God, how do we relate to false teachers, how do we relate to all these different areas. And so there is a loose structure to this past chapter, but it does not feel that way all the time. But this passage here, judging others, sorry, something wrong throat. A lot. Wow. Okay, we're good. A lot of people know these words, but they misunderstand. You probably heard people say, "Don't judge me," right? Judge not. And then they'll have like something that says, "Only God can judge me," as if that's better than me judging you, And so people are like, "Well, Jesus says to not judge." Okay, well, what does he actually mean by that? Yes, he says, "Judge not, that you not be judged." But just because we have to begin to ask what he actually means by what he's saying. And so let me read this passage here, and hopefully it can gain some clarity on it. Jesus says this: "Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you seek the speck that is in your brother's eye? Why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take out the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you." So let's just work through some of the observations here. So what command does Jesus give in the very first verse? Do not judge. So this is the principle that Jesus gives. He says, "Do not judge," and then he explains his reasoning for it. Which is question 2, what rule or standard is set regarding how a person judges others? He says, do not judge. Why? Because
the judgment you pronounce will be judged. The measure you use will be measured.
Whatever measurement or standard you use to judge others will be used to measure you. Which is a good thing to remind ourselves of. More often than not, we fail to meet our own measure of whatever it is that we're judging people under, And so we like to maximize the flaws of other people while minimizing our own flaws. And then what 2 objects did Jesus use in verses 3 through 5 to illustrate judging someone while ignoring your own faults? Speck and a plank or a log. Yeah, a speck is just a little piece of sawdust, You pat them fly into your eye, they're uncomfortable, you don't like it. But it's an outrageous metaphor because, one, it's really hard to see a speck. You feel it, but you don't really. How often have you actually noticed a speck in somebody's eye? But it's you noticing a little tiny speck in somebody's eye while you have a massive log coming out of your eye. It's a hilarious picture that Jesus has used to show our hypocrisy. And connected to that, what does Jesus call the person who tries to remove the speck while not doing anything with the log in her own? He calls them a what? A hypocrite. Yep. And so then Jesus gives instructions. What must happen first before a person can clearly remove the speck from a brother's eye? He said they must first do what? Take the log out of yours and then address the speck in your brother's. And then we get to verse 6, which seems out of place, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But what are the 2 items, one's sacred, one's valuable, that Jesus mentions in verse 6, and what are the animals that they're given to or thrown to?
What is holy and pearls.
Pearls. What is holy and pearls, and what are they given to?
Dogs and pigs.
Dogs and pigs. Okay, so there's a lot to interpret here. I don't think Jesus is giving you literal instructions on not throwing pearls to pigs, right? We certainly don't have actual logs in our eyes. And even here, we'll see that what Jesus actually is not forbidding is judgment of any sort. So there is a judgment that we are called to have as believers. We honestly can't even understand verse 6 without judging somebody, because we have to make a judgment. Is this person a dog or a pig? And then later, he tells us to judge. He's with verse 15, beware of false prophets who come to you. Okay, you're going to have to be able to judge if someone's a false prophet or a genuine prophet. So there is judgment that we use in the Christian life, but he's speaking of a different type of judgment. Righteous judgment, discerning judgment. I think we'll get into here. He's prohibiting this just harsh, overcritical judgment. You know.
Look what she wore, etc. Can you believe that?
Yeah, constantly pointing at little minutia. Yeah. And so let's talk about that. What does Jesus mean when he says judge not? Is he prohibiting all moral evaluation, or is he prohibiting a specific type of it? Yeah. Yeah, like I mentioned before, verse 6 and verse 15 to follow would be impossible to fulfill Jesus' teaching there if we aren't judging in some form or fashion somebody. That's what we do with the church when we bring in new members. What we do, we're making a judgment on their profession of faith. We're saying, as best as we can tell, we believe that you are united with Jesus, that you're a Christian. We're making a judgment when we say we're welcoming you into membership. And so what Jesus is saying here is that to judge does not mean to turn a blind eye to other brother's faults, or to refuse to discern between truth or error, goodness or evil. He's not prohibiting all different types of discernment. Rather, he is condemning this hypocritical, self-righteous, hypercritical judgment where a person condemns others while ignoring their own moral failures. So the reason he's a hypocrite is not because he's pointed out a speck in his brother's eye. The reason he's a hypocrite is why? Because he has a log coming out of his own eye. He's ignoring his own faults while being hypercritical to the small ways that his brother is falling short. So Jesus is not saying don't ever cast a judgment upon somebody. Don't ever point out that your brother has a speck in his eye. He's saying when you do so, just make sure that you're also calling out your own sin, which is probably far greater because you're blinded by it than your own. I've always told people, you should always imagine what is it like to be on the other side of a conversation with you. It's a fun thought experiment to think. What is it like to talk to Addison? What is it like to be on the other side? Because we don't see ourselves in the right light. People see things about us that we don't see in ourselves. And so sometimes you don't really see your plank, your moments of weaknesses, your shortcomings, unless you look at it through the view of how someone else is receiving what you're saying. And so, so Jesus is not telling us to not assess people critically, but he's telling us to not judge them harshly. I don't know if you grew up in environments like that before where you're just around hypercritical people. Criticism is not a fruit of the Spirit, no matter how much people want to make it a fruit of the Spirit. Finding faults, finding shortcomings in people is not a fruit of the Spirit. Gentleness is, love is, patience is, all those different things. And so the command that Jesus is saying here is not to judge, not to be blind, but rather it's a plea to be generous towards other people. Too often in our lives we assume people's motives for why they do certain things. They'll make an action and be like, oh, they did this because of this. And the motives that we usually assume to them are not good motives, are they? And I think the way of Jesus is to assume the best, especially from your brothers and sisters in Christ. That if they have a shortcoming, you just assume the best. If they say something that might come across hurtful, assume that they didn't mean it to be hurtful. Assume that
You never know what someone else is going through at that time. You're not walking in their shoes, so they may say or do something that you don't like, you don't approve of, but you don't know why they did.
Yeah. So to be generous towards people Christians should not be these hardened, hypercritical people. We should be generous. Doesn't mean we ignore faults. Doesn't mean we don't help people see their sin and walk with them through it. But Christians can sometimes get the reputation of being fault finders, right? They'll point out every single thing in your life that you got going wrong and think that they're standing on the moral high ground. In reality, it's like, hey, being a Christian is recognizing that you are a sinner in need of grace. That's like Christianity 101. It's like we come to Jesus because we need a Savior. And so I got a lot of planks in my eye.
Always be kind.
Always be kind, yes. And so what does the contrast between the speck and the plank signify about our own self-awareness?
The size of it, because you're looking at a little speck there, and I mean, you got this big old white line.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. If you had a plank in your eye, do you think you could see clearly?
Or trying to cover up.
Yeah.
Or sin basically not.
Yeah.
It's kind of like we can't see past it. You can't see past it.
Yeah.
Yet we see that,
It's silly. I mean, the illustration's hilarious because he's assuming you have a plank in your eye and you're able to see the speck in your brother's eye. It'd be like in a jail, in a courtroom, you bring up your crime witness for who viewed the crime, and it's someone who's legally blind. And it's just like, someone who's legally blind should be the one sitting in the chair saying, you did this, right? And so he's saying in the same way, like, we're not even qualified to cast judgment upon people. Why? Because we're fallen. We're sinners as well. We're among the judge, which is what he says here. He says that for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured against you. And so we're among the judged, but then also we can't render a good judgment because of our own sin.
We're too quick to judge before we're there.
Yeah, very too quick to judge. And sin does multiple things. Sin often will maximize the flaws of other people while simultaneously minimizing your own flaws. And so, which we should flip that. We should almost be more generous. We're almost generous with ourselves and very harsh towards other people, but we almost need to flip that. Not that you be harsh to yourself, but the level of scrutiny that you use to examine other people, examine yourself with that, and the type of generosity that you often use to excuse your own shortcomings, extend that to other people. But we often flip that, right? We often have all the excuses in our mind of why this thing is happening in our life, and we're generous toward ourselves, but then
Sometimes too, when you see somebody that does something that way, you immediately judge it and say, well, I would have done this. But you will find yourself at the time of when they did it, you may have done the same thing.
yeah,
But once you have time to think about what they did, you think, well, I would have done it this way. And sometimes you don't. It's like you're just as bad as they are.
yeah. It's always good. It's always easy to play Monday morning quarterback. You know that phrase is like it's always like, oh, he shouldn't have thrown that pass. Well, were you in the game? Like it's easy to be like, it's just like, oh, well, I would have thrown it this way. Well, yeah, because now you saw, through replay, you saw everything, And so, ironically, the worst fault finders are the ones who cannot be convinced of their own faults. And so, maybe you've seen that, like the people who point out the most harsh things in people, rather, very seldom do they actually see their own faults or will receive it, So this is what Jesus is addressing. He's not addressing ever casting a judgment, making moral decisions, discerning decisions. He is saying don't be overly harsh with others and very generous with yourself because you got a plank in your own eye while they have a speck in theirs. So he was doing, so Jesus says this in verse 1. He says, judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce you'll be judged, and with the measure you use it will be judged against you. So who is doing the judgment in the passive statement, you too will be judged, and it will be measured against you? So who will be judging us? God, yeah. It's a divine passive which refers primarily to God's ultimate judgment. And so Not only are we not the judge of other people, we are among the judged. And so he's essentially saying, you're acting like a judge, but don't forget that you are also condemned under an actual righteous judge who doesn't have a plank inside. He doesn't have a speck in his. He sees all things clearly, and he's going to hold you to probably even a greater standard, God's moral and perfect law, than the standard that you hold other people to. In verse 5, does Jesus mean that believers should never help correct their faults? How do you know that? What?
First take the plank out of your eye. I think once you take it out of your eye, you see what that individual is going through.
Yeah. So it's a matter of priority. He's not saying never address the speck in your brother's eye. He's saying just first search yourself, take the plank out of your own, and then when you see clearly. So it's just a matter of sequence. It's not, you never address your brother's sin. Sometimes you can take this and be like, well, I'm not going to address that because I'm just a sinner too, and I know that. But part of being the church member, part of helping people follow Jesus is to help them see their sin and crucify it and receive grace and forgiveness. I mean, you shouldn't want people to see the sin in your heart, in your life. Why? Because sin destroys, and you don't want to keep drinking that poison, right? You want people to help do that, but in a spirit of gentleness, right? So Jesus is not telling us to mind our own business. We still have a brotherly responsibility towards other. I mean, later in Matthew 18, he talks about this. He says, if your brother sins against you, you go to him one-on-one. You make known his sin. If you repent, you gain your brother back. If not, you bring one or two with you. You go to him. If not, you bring it to the church. And it's just, he just tells us to address sin.
But sometimes when you do address that sin, you understand their view on it, and then therefore you can discuss that view. It's like you're not realizing what they're going through.
Yeah.
And then it's something that you can, I found that out more recently with my sister. It's a lot easier.
Yeah.
To sit down and say, hey, let's see. What do you feel?
Yeah, let's see the heart. Where's this coming from? It's easy to see the surface level, but we all have reasons. Again, someone might do the same sin, but have a different reason for doing that same sin. Someone might steal because they need food. Someone might steal just because they like the jolt of stealing. They both stole. One did it because they're trying to feed themselves. Not saying that's right, but the one did it just because they like thrill. They just want to be, mischievous. But we have to, when we approach our brother, we should read Galatians 6:1. It says, restoring a brother, you who are spiritual, restore a brother in a spirit of gentleness. And so we are like a surgeon. A surgeon is very delicate in how they use a scalpel, right? We don't come in like a butcher. We don't come in with a chainsaw on people. We take a very tender scalpel and we address the problem with tender care. Now it still hurts. Scalpel can do some damage, but it's a lot less catastrophic than taking a machete. Yeah, it's a clean cut. And it's addressed in a very particular way, a careful way, a self-controlled way. And that's how you do it with the spirit of gentle. You want your surgeon to be gentle, right? You don't want him to be careless with that in his hand. And so Jesus is telling us that we are neither to be judging, so we're not called to be harsh or condemning. We're also called not to be hypocritical, where we're blaming others and excusing ourselves. But we are first to care for others by correcting ourselves and then seeking to be constructive in the help that we give. And so we need to be as critical with ourselves as we often are of others, and as generous to others as we are ourselves. We need to remember that I am first a sinner, and then second, I am sinned against. And that sequence is important. We often think primarily you always focus on someone else's sin against you. But Scripture kind of points to, address your own sin, search for your own sin. You are first a sinner, so ask the Lord in any conflict, how does my sin add to this conflict? What did I do to be about that? It might only be a little bit, but address that, and then you address your brother's sin. So now we get to this seemingly random verse, verse 6, where he says, do not give dogs what is holy, do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. So we have to figure out what each of these mean. So let's look at the animals first. So what is a dog and what is a pig? What do you think would signify? Remember, this is a Jewish audience.
Pigs are unclean.
Mm-hmm.
Jewish people.
Yeah. 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 So pigs are unclean, and when you think of these dogs, I don't want you to think of your dog at home that's well kept and nice, and these are like ravaging, like street dogs. Yeah, scavengers, and so again, unclean. They eat garbage. They're not very nice and cuddly. So you have pigs and dogs, which represent unclean individuals, potentially hardened. What do you think what is sacred or what is holy and pearls represent? Pearls are valuable. There's a teaching that Jesus does about the pearl of great value, and it represents the gospel. And so what is most valuable and holy to the Christian is the message of the gospel that Christ has done for us. And so Jesus is giving us this picture here. He's essentially saying a Jew would never throw holy food to unclean dogs. That would defame what is holy. And you would never dream of throwing pearls to pigs. One, a pig doesn't know what a pearl is. He probably thinks it's food. He's going to try to eat the pearl. He's going to realize it's not food. And then he's going to get angry. And that's what he says. And then, so that they'll trample over in anger and then turn to attack you because they're mad that you didn't give them real food. And so what he's giving us this illustration of you sharing the gospel with somebody who returns with it with anger and attacks you because you've shared with them something that is precious. And Jesus is saying there comes a time, very seldomly, where you stop throwing pearls to pigs, where you stop presenting and sharing the gospel with this individual person, because all it does is enrages them to a certain level that they begin to attack you. Now, this has only happened maybe I can only think of like one scenario in my mind where this has happened to me. Oftentimes, the thing that you ought to be doing is sharing with non-believers. But you see this primarily online and stuff where people are just baiting Christians to say something and then they just pounce you. They're not trying to listen. They're not trying to understand. They're just trying to get bait to attack you. And at that point, stop throwing to them what is valuable and what is precious. They're just going to trample over it. It's just going to enrage them. And I've heard this quote a long time. I don't know who came up with it. It says, never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty and the pig likes it. And so it's like, all you do is the pig loves that kind of stuff. And you're just going to get dirty. It's not going to be resourceful. So Jesus actually says, connecting this to before, he says, do not judge other people with that same standard, but also be discerning. You have to be discerning to know that I'm not going to throw these pearls of great value to these pigs. And so it's not, I'm just going to assume everybody is good and fine. You do have to make a judgment statement at time. So he warns us against judgmentalism, but he also warns us against being undiscriminating, especially in our choice of people to whom we should present the wonderful riches of the gospel. And so again, that's very, very seldom, I would say, that you shouldn't share the gospel with a non-believer. This is someone who's shown persistent rebellion to it. I mean, Jesus says this when he sends out his disciples, they go to different homes, and if they don't receive you, then knock the dust off your feet and go to the next. There's a point where, okay, you've shared the gospel, and now they're so hardened to it that they just respond with anger and violence, and it's only going to enrage them more, and it's not going to be beneficial. So stop throwing the pearls to the pigs. So, any questions on this passage here?
Okay, first review, it's like the first 6 doesn't really fit
Yeah.
in that. Yeah.
it doesn't. It's kind of its own thought, but you can see kind of how it can be connected to not to judging others, where it's like, hey, judge not, but also don't be undiscriminate. Like, still have a discerning mind about what you're doing moving forward. So next week we'll do ask and it will be given, and so you can take that with you and study it ahead of time. Finish up here.